And now I'd like to welcome David and Stephen to the stage. Thank you. We have some entertainment too, Nicola. Is it cued? The song? Are we playing that now? Carla, how is it with the song? Carla. Is it ready? All right, so it's ready. So David, I think you need to introduce it.
No.
All right. All right, I'll give you a little introduction. So we're going to play a song now. And then after the song's over, David will explain a little bit more about it. But it's a song about dynamic competition. So now we have our own theme song. Carla? Okay, all right. Well, we'll have to.
Hello. You know they teach you in school that markets like to settle down, find an equilibrium. But I've been looking out at the Arno River today, and I'll tell you, nothing stays still for long. The innovators are always coming down the tracks. I hear the market coming, it's rolling round the bend, and I ain't seen a steady state since I don't know when. I'm standing in Firenze, beneath the Duomo's dome, but those gales of destruction are bringing the future home. Now the Medici had the power, they held the market tight, thought they had a monopoly, sleeping through the night. But competition ain't a painting framed upon the wall, it's a restless locomotive, and it's coming for us all. Yeah, the old guard thinks they're safest when they lock the fortress gate, but a brand new way of doing things just sealed their bitter fate. Because the market keeps on moving, it's a dynamic fight. You can't just rest on yesterday or you'll fade into the night. Yeah, the barriers are breaking, the innovators rise. Dynamic competition, Lord, it's right before your eyes. Because you can't stop the future, I walk the Schumpeter line. I wear the black for the defeated, the firms that went astray, who thought their market share was safe and couldn't find a way. They chased efficiency and margins, squeezed every penny tight, but they missed the paradigm shifting in the middle of the night. Now their patents are just paper, their factories are still, while a kid with a new idea is coming up the hill. So listen to the rhythm, the boom chicka boom of change. If you try to block the progress, you'll end up out of range. You don't need perfect knowledge, just the grit to take a stand. When that dynamic competition comes tearing From the cobblestones of Florence to the Silicon Valley sun, the battle for the market, boy, is never truly done. Because the market keeps on moving, it's a dynamic fight. You can't just rest on yesterday or you'll fade into the night. Yeah, the barriers are breaking, the innovators rise. Dynamic competition, Lord, it's right before your eyes. Because you can't stop the future. I'll walk the Schumpeter line. Yeah, the train is moving. Creative destruction down the tracks. Hear the whistle blow.
Just to give you the origins of this, I have a digital twin. So I just asked the twin to compose a song, maybe a little bit in the style of Johnny Cash, about dynamic competition, and just let it go. And it took him 30 seconds, and that's what you get. So anyway, that's the point, that it's about paradigms and shifting the paradigm, and that's what we're here to talk about. So go ahead, Stephen.
You've been touring other cities in Europe since?
Yeah, you can use this one then.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. Well, it's very nice to be here with so many friends, old and new. And of course, I think none more distinguished in the room than the distinguished scholar of strategy and innovation at the University of South Florida, professor of the graduate school at UC-Berkeley, the author of 30 books, 250,000 citations to his articles. I just checked. The exact number on the dynamic capabilities paper as of right now is 65,508 citations, a very high market share, but we know in this audience that that is not a problem because it's a dynamic innovation, of course. So it's really a great honor to be here with the holder of 9 honorary doctorates, Professor David Teece. So we have a bit of ground to cover, a lot of ground to cover, and not that much time. So I thought quickly we might look at the history before looking at some current problems. And one thing that struck me in some of your recent writing is that you mention a pivotal conference for dynamic competition in 1989. So you summarized it as the conference included most of the leading light in antitrust law and economics at the time. And then it's a real all-star cast: Philip Arida, Bill Baxter, David Turner, Richard Schmalensee, Oliver Williamson, Frank Easterbrook, and Richard Gilbert for good measure. So, you know, if you collect the baseball cards for antitrust, you got them all. How did you assemble this?
Well, first of all, I should point out it wasn't on dynamic competition. It was a centennial of the Sherman Act. Sherman Act was passed in 1890, so this was 1990. But it was my mission to turn it into, my failed mission, to turn it into a dynamic competition event, although we did get started. Just by way of background, of course, the Chicago school had just gotten its foot in the door, and along with the Chicago school, economics had got its foot in the door. And so this was a reason for celebrating the Sherman Act. But I put my mission to myself is to point out to everybody, well, it's fantastic we got economics in the door. The problem is we brought in the wrong economics. because Chicago economics, static microeconomics, innovation is basically not in the picture. If it's there at all, it's some exogenous thing and it's not tied in any way. So needless to say, I was not particularly popular at that conference because a lot of the legal profession had to bone up a little bit on microeconomics. And so the last thing they wanted to hear after they had spent several years getting familiar with these efficiency arguments that really efficiency didn't matter anywhere near as much as innovation, and that there hadn't been a word of that from the Chicago School. And if you look carefully at what the Chicago School was saying about innovation, it's sort of like an unnecessary cost that messes things up. So the neoclassical finesse that we were talking about yesterday wasn't really with Chicago, because they were not finessing things anyway. They were at the microeconomics level. It was simply that the innovation story was missing. And it was, if it was mentioned at all, was a cost that was questionable and maybe should be eliminated. R&D was an unnecessary cost that maybe should be eliminated for greater efficiency. That's pretty much, if you read Easterbrook and Posner, the story that you get. So my message was, no, we have to go back to Schumpeter. And when I say Schumpeter, I now have to qualify myself, because every economist, almost every economist, thinks that Schumpeter, at least back then, and to a large extent now, it was all about big firms are necessary for innovation. Anybody that knows Schumpeter knows he said, yes, he said that, but he also said small firms are necessary for innovation in a different book. But the key theme of Schumpeter was that innovation is the primary driver of competition, not efficiency, but innovation. And you know, it's so much more important than bombardment is with respect to forcing a door. Some imagery, wonderful imagery like that. So the goal was to get that message out there, and I can say it's substantially failed, although we have to remember that there was some progress, because Richie Gilbert was there, and he kind of came along with this, and then went to the Department of Justice, and we had the IP guidelines that came out, which actually, with respect to collusion and issues like that, we did make some early progress. But with respect to what in the U.S. is called Section 2, monopoly questions and mergers and acquisitions, essentially no progress. And even with post-Chicago, almost no progress, because neither Chicago nor post-Chicago featured innovation to any significant degree.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think that really helps to set the scene about how initially this was a heterodox way of thinking and has already become more mainstream. So there are some lovely phrases which feature prominently in your writing: the ability to see around corners, the street lamp theory of evidence, that only the evidence under the street lamp is seen, which in a sense is the least useful evidence, and that this greatly understates uncertainty as competition. So I was hoping to ask you, considering that we're in a room of people who interact a lot with a wider enforcement community, do you have a recommended elevator pitch for these concepts, if there is even such a thing as an elevator pitch for an antitrust idea?
You know, the essence is, yes, of course, competition is important for innovation. I mean, grant that right off. But secondly, you know, innovation is the primary driver. It's not just one way. If you go look at the textbooks on antitrust, to the extent to which they now deal with innovation, it's like competition is important for innovation. Yes, but so is it the other way around. So you know, the endogeneity, absent an understanding of the endogeneity, you're not going to understand innovation. And of course, you mentioned the flattering number of citations I have for dynamic capabilities. I haven't checked, but I suspect I have a big fat 0 of citations in the economics literature. It won't get over what Kuhn calls the protective belt of economics. Yet at the same time, in dynamic dynamic capabilities and dynamic competition, I have lots of citations to the economics literature. So like there's this one-way street where economics goes out, but it can't climb over this wall So seeing around corners, of course, even though there's now a lot of work on behavioral economics, it still hasn't gotten into, behavioral economics has gotten in on the consumer side. The problem is on the firm side, it's a big, fat, empty box still. And this is what we have to populate with concepts that are useful and meaningful in antitrust analysis. That's why we can't talk about potential competition hasn't moved in any significant way for 100 years. Understanding of why? Because there's no theory of the firm and firm development in economics, in antitrust economics, as well as economics more generally. So these are the problems we have to deal with.
Thank you. So just pivoting to a few of the recent cases. Now, one thing that really struck me in many of your recent articles is that there are some very strong negative views on cases, which I think many of us in this room wouldn't much like. But I noticed you pulled a few punches, so I'm curious as to what you think makes the difference between a good and a bad case in recent enforcement. I noticed, for example, your comments on Facebook Giphy, Amazon iRobot. We've addressed Illumina Grail considerably at this conference, Adobe Figma features. But then there are the cases sometimes seen as a missed opportunity, Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. Considering that some might think this an anti-enforcement message, are there any examples of good interventions that spring to mind?
Well, I haven't had a chance to study all of this, and more work needs to be done. But let me, since I have been digging into a case recently, let me talk about it, which is Google search. And I want to come back to Fred's point this morning that the problem is the courts. I don't think the problem's the courts. I think the problem is lawyers and economists. And actually, Doug Melamed, who was general counsel at Intel, in conversations with Nicholas and myself, written conversations, basically came to the same view. And let's just talk for a moment about this recent case in the United States, the Google search case. First of all, market definition. Snip test clearly doesn't work. I mean, I wrote several papers on this 20 years ago for why it's not appropriate for the tech sector, and you'll end up with, many monopoly firms that are $5 million in revenues, and they won't pass the snip test because, they got something really special and different. And anyway, it turned out that we were back to brown shoe, and somehow rather, despite the fact that by the time this thing was in court, you had rampant competition from AI, all of this stuff, the way the government put forward the case, and I don't know all the details of the way Google invented it, but they ended up still being branded as, a monopolist in search when we know that that's no longer the case. So question is, why was that? What went wrong with the economics? What went wrong with the case? And maybe it's just a discovery issue. I don't know. But the more important thing, as I dug into that case, there was this question of, why was Google paying all this money to Apple, and was that exclusionary just to get the iPhone, loaded with Google search? And there were these explanations that weren't fulsome in any way in terms of explaining why Google had such a large market share. And there was one enormously glaring issue, which was Microsoft, while it had Bing, was not willing to invest enough to keep up with Google. And that's, in my view, because Steve Ballmer, who was running the company for 15 years, was a complete dunce. And I say that, it sounds a little silly, but if you actually look at the stock price during the whole Ballmer period, it was flat. He missed the iPhone, coming back to seeing around corners. He missed 3 or 4 opportunities to see around corners. Now, this cannot get into the court using standard economic analysis because the firm is understood by economists doesn't have managers. There is no management in the theory of the firm. It's been driven out. There's no entrepreneur in the theory of the firm. There's no management. So highlighting the role of management as a potential explanation. Yes, you can talk about firm conduct, you can talk about firm behavior, but the notion of managerial mistakes, this doesn't fit. But it's clearly the case that Google was incredibly good and invested heavily in search, and Microsoft wasn't willing to do the same. It wasn't exclusive. Microsoft could have come along and competed for the same space on the iPhone that Apple had, but it didn't. But these issues are just not addressed. There's evidence in the record you could have turned to, but the economists don't know what to do with it. And the court is open. Judge Mehta, he had the good and the bad news is he had never done an antitrust case. So I don't think he was biased. He wasn't saying, give me more static microeconomics, please. That was not coming from the bench, and nor is it coming from the statutes. So I push back, Fred, just a little bit to say the courts won't buy this. In the US, I think the courts will buy it. And I've been in front of enough courts to know that, in fact, if you put evidence out there, or if you use evidence that's in the record, the juries love it and the courts love it. It's not hard. It's not hard. It's not impossible, for sure. And we just haven't done enough of it. And there's enough scope in the case law to get this through. Initially, when I started on this journey, I thought, oh, maybe you need legislative change, and that's going to make the paradigm change hard. You don't need legislative change. We are the enemy. We are the enemy against innovation, us professionals, the broad us collectively. And that's why it made sense to form the Dynamic Competition Initiative. Otherwise, we'd say, let's go see if we can get some corporations to go lobby this group or that group. We've not done that. We've realized the problem. We looked in the mirror. The problem is us. Not you in the room, of course, the people that are not in the room.
Thank you. Well, you'll know the soldier's adage, the true soldier is afraid of the soldier behind him more than the soldier on the other side. And it sounds like there's an element of friendly fire here. I'm very glad that you raised the Google search case because, it's such a great focus as a concrete example of where a dynamic approach makes such a big difference to the outcomes. Some of the things going through your writing on this that really made me chuckle, since just a couple of weeks ago, I happened to be at a roundtable that the UK CMA did on its Google search remedies. And it's just such a different paradigm. So I noticed in your article, you mention not wanting Me Too innovation. So, and I quote, having Microsoft or Apple invest billions to develop a second or third rate search engine isn't necessarily good and need not fuel dynamic competition. Yes, Me Too entry isn't that useful. It's just a duplicative cost, right? Another possible heresy for that crowd would be defaults helping to improve the user experience. So I was really struck by this. Defaults improve the user experience because they support Google's innovation to the benefit of both Google and users. An obvious and sound point, but very difficult to make before some regulators because of the lack of a dynamic focus. And I wanted to elevate a couple of the points from the record that you mentioned, which are so striking. So from Microsoft, quote, we improved the flight's answer. That doesn't necessarily mean we improve traffic, providing better answers to the users we have. Distribution is a different thing. That's just worth repeating. In Microsoft's words, distribution is a different thing. And Google, in its closing, said, even if you flip the browser agreements so that Google was not the default, we have a choice screen, if we take the data and the learning we have, what's the incremental shift? 0.9% is the answer. So in a sense, we're having this very narrow debate about a choice screen, which is affecting less than 1% of the market. My question based on this review of the case is why the fixation on choice screens?
Well, the issue comes down to causation. And you see, there's nothing there's no other competing theory in the courtroom as to why Google might have ended up with this monopoly, or this high market share. It wasn't a monopoly. And the failure, interestingly, is partly in Google's hands, partly in the government's hands, and partly in the court's hands. I think the court actually had how open mind. That's why the relief, the judge knew that his liability story was basically wrong. So he says, I can't break this thing up. What I got to do something. Let me do a tiny little something. That was his way of saying, I got the liability wrong, but I had to go this way because the government led me that way, and Google did a piss poor job of going the other way. And, you know, I've actually looked at Google's own economic experts did a piss poor job, quite frankly. You know, I kind of felt like I needed to call the Legal Aid Society to help Google. You know, it is because they're stuck. And, you know, it's obviously not a matter of finding a few extra dollars. It's a metaphor that I'm using to say that they could have done better for themselves. And the judge had an open mind, and you know, but now Google's sort of stuck with an opinion it didn't want. But you know, it could have been the other way. I mean, these dynamic competition doesn't mean that you get off the hook all the time. It means that you focus on what's important, and there's a lot more that could be said about that, and a lot more work that needs to be done. Why is it left to me? This is what I can't figure out. To pour through these, you know, I'm spending most of my time doing other things, and I kind of got to pour through the record of this to sort this out. You know, I wish there was 500 people pouring through the records to sort this out. There should be, but they're not, because they don't understand the alternative paradigm.
So that raises the billing for this, of course, which is the Copernican moment. And one thing that's so interesting with the history with Copernicus, I was intrigued to find out in preparing for this, is how the models of the solar system before Copernicus were, you know, reasonably accurate in some regards. You could trace some things, but people were tracing the wrong things. And it's sometimes said that the reason why his model took root was simply that it worked better. So I wondered what your thoughts were about why dynamic theories work better than static ones.
They work better in this tech sector because they're more consistent with the evidence. I mean, every time you take a static approach and look at a tech sector, you're banging a square peg into a round hole. And, you know, I've had experience with this in the courtroom. It goes, the dynamic arguments go just fine when there are dynamics in the marketplace. So the problem is we don't have experts that are really adept at using this evidence. You don't have lawyers. You know, the lawyers are now stuck in their own groove. And that part of the problem too. You know, that's it's an impartial answer, but, you know, the question is this a Copernican moment? I don't know. It could be Copernican squared in the following sense. I think the Copernican moment is that innovation swamps efficiency arguments. Are we there yet? No. But I think they have to, if competition policy is to survive, because we're in a world of great power competition, and it's all about innovation, the survival of our economies, survival of democracy, survival of most of the things we care about depends on leadership and innovation. Europe, the United States is flagging, and Europe is flagged, past tense. If we don't fix this, we don't have much left of the societies or the structure of the society we want. So I think that there's going to be a second Copernican moment, which is, and it's starting to happen on the panels here. We've had 2 or 3 panels where this discussion is now brought into the geopolitical arena. And Fred, you spent your whole life on this. But it seems to me that the geopolitics is going to take over, or is taking over, and one way or the other, the political system is either going to fail or it's going to have to revert and put innovation number one, figure out how to do that. I think that's elements of that are starting to happen in the United States, but we haven't gotten very far on it. And when that happens, then, you know, industrial policy, if we can get innovation into industrial policy, excuse me, put it different. If we get innovation into competition policy, then it can sit more comfortably with industrial policy and in fact guide industrial policy, which is what we want. If that doesn't happen, then I think competition policy gets marginalized, becomes maybe just as what in the US we call Section 1, or it's around conspiracy and cooperation and cartels. That's it. Everything else will go off into industrial policy, and competition policy as a field as we understand it today will have failed.
Thank you. And I'm glad you raised the industrial policy question because, you know, I do recall the old adage that the best industrial policy is no industrial policy, right? The whole debate about the merger regulation going back and so forth. It sounds like you couldn't reject that more strongly.
Well, my view is industrial policies, every country has them. US has always had them historically. At that conference I was referring to, actually, Philip Arita got up and his headline was, Antitrust is America's industrial policy. Of course, we'd just gone through the AT&T divestiture, where, by the way, static economics had come into play. We took down, with static economics, static competition policy, we took down Western civilization's greatest research lab, Bell Labs. We didn't have to do it that way. It could have been done. You could have had divestiture and you could have preserved Bell Labs. Blame lies both with the government, with the economics profession, and with AT&T, in my view. But down the toilet went Western civilization's greatest research lab with, I don't know, just as many Nobel laureates as Berkeley has, but more importantly, a multidisciplinary research lab. That's how we got the transistor. That's how we got a lot of the things that we all feed off of still today. Multidisciplinary stuff, which universities can't do, despite the fact that universities claim to be multidisciplinary. They're really not. They're in their fiefdoms, whereas at Bell Labs, those people were pushed together. And you got to look at the story behind the invention of the transistor. And it was, you know, it was chemistry, it was physics, it was multiple disciplines that were easily brought together in that corporate environment. And we have flushed corporate research down the toilet, except for in big tech, through financialization of the economy. And to a limited extent, Europe's done some of the same. This is the problem, is that even back then, the static story was harming innovation. Now I've lost the question. I'm sorry, Stephen. What was it?
That's fine. I was just asking if you reject or embrace an industrial policy when all is said and done.
Well, one, we have an industrial policy. Industrial policy should not be about picking winners. And in fact, this is where competition policy comes in. You know, there's going to be various programs to, you know, advance. You know, in the US, we have one now for the semiconductor industry. Competition principles should be front and center. But if we don't get innovation into competition policy, how the heck can competition policy effectively help industrial policy if the key aim of industrial policy is to improve innovation? So this mission that we have in this room is not just about competition policy, it's bringing about the necessary alignment with industrial policy and technology policy so we can have a coherent set of policies in Europe and the United States that are not fighting each other. The Chinese have figured this stuff out. We're still bumbling around, and it's going to cost us dearly. It already is.
So I think your comment highlights the thing I always remember about the AT&T divestiture, which is that I seem to recall Judge Green said he wouldn't want it to be written on his gravestone. And I think you can see why when you consider, you know, some of the costs of the lost innovation. But happily, we do have large innovative companies. They're clearly under threat. I'm very curious about your thoughts about the price of failure if the paradigm shift doesn't occur.
Yeah, well, I was hinting at that. I mean, the good news for America and the bad news for Europe. The good news for America is that we have some significant tech companies that have scaled to global significance, or at least significance in the Western world. And because you still have the founders' influence in many of them, they heavily invest in R&D. You know, Apple, of course, after Jobs, you know, it doesn't have quite the same commitment to innovation that it had, and its R&D to sales ratio is less than 10%. But if you look at, you know, Google and Microsoft, you know, the healthy double digits, and NVIDIA, healthy double-digit investments in R&D, because the boys and the girls in Wall Street are not going to take these guys on. This is the fundamental problem we have with innovation in America, is the capital markets and the agency problem, which our field of economics has misdefined. We've spent, you know, since Berlin Means in the 1930s, we've seen the primary agency problem as being between the manager and the owner. That's pathetically small, in my view, compared to the agency problem between the money and the money managers. So we have all this pension money, billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, which gets put in the hands of 5-year, 3-year managers, who then, you know, jumps on the bandwagon of the shareholder activists who come on in and say, cut costs. And so you have not only the economics profession with its ideology of efficiency and cost cutting, but you got the financial sector with the same ideology, and guess what loses? Innovation. So the beauty of the big tech guys is, you know, guys like Elon Musk can thumb their nose, and he does thumb his nose at Wall Street. But, you know, after Elon Musk, I guarantee you, you know, his enterprise will become like everything else, everybody else's, and boards of directors will get in there, and managers will figure out that if they want to keep their seat, they better chop R&D and don't do anything really ambitious, and you know, just behave like Europe.
Thank you. And I mean, I think that's such a hopeful parallel in a way to the Berlin Means debate, because of course that is an example where high quality research people like Harold Demsetz and Ken Lane and so on did manage to achieve a paradigm shift in how people view the corporation and view shareholder protection. So I think there is actually quite a hopeful message there in your remarks, if I may say so. So I'm conscious that we're sitting here between people and lunch, but I can't resist asking you, you did say once that you'll scream if someone says dynamic efficiency. This puzzled me because it's in the introductory chapter to most antitrust texts, whether legal or economic. So why do these books make you scream?
Yes. Anybody that spent more than 6 months studying the innovation literature will know that there's always a tension between efficiency and innovation. Think of the Ford Motor Company way back when. You know, Henry Ford said, I'll give you Model T Ford in any color you want, so long as it's black. And, you know, pursued efficiency, you know, but eventually, you know, that ran its course. And literally, people forget this. Henry Ford had to shut the Ford Motor Company down for like a year to come up with the next new model, which was a Model A. So if you pursue efficiency relentlessly, you're going to drive out innovation. This is well understood in the management of technology literature. Yet us economists, because we kind of know, let me put it this way, the static school has to bend a little bit to the dynamic efficiency story. We can at least take some credit for that. We've made an impact. So what do? They don't want to give up the efficiency stuff, so they talk about dynamic efficiency. It's an oxymoron. It reminds me of sailing ships in the 19th century when steamers came along, and steamers were faster. You know what some of the sailing ships did? They put a false funnel on the sailing ship, on the deck, to make it look like a steamer. To me, dynamic efficiency, and since this is about paradigm shifts in a Copernican moment, Dynamic efficiency is exactly that. That's the static school putting up a false funnel that says, hey, listen, you know, we're onto this innovation wicket. But they're not. They're not, because some of the things that Brian Arthur told us about, you know, some of the formalism of economics and this finesse of economics. So yet another Nobel Prize goes out to Aghion in economics. And I guarantee you it's flies to fly paper in terms of what the competition authorities are going to look at now, which is patent races. You know, patent races in the economic, if you read just the economics literature of innovation, you would think the whole game is about patent races, because, you know, about half the literature in innovation is on that. And I sit on I sit on a dozen boards. I got 8 different companies that I'm venture capital investor in. Maybe in some corner of the pharmaceutical industry, here and there in the economy, yeah, there are patent races. But after the eBay decision in the United States, you can't get injunctive power. I don't know anybody who would think that a patent race is strategically important, except for very short periods of time and very short, limited circumstances. But this is a dominant paradigm, or a dominant paradigm in economics. Why? Because we can model that. And you get the Nobel Prize for it. So what does that do to the young scholars coming up? They're going to fall into the same trap, the neoclassical finesse. And real studies of innovation, both Fred and yourself and others saying, you know, where is the real studies of innovation, and you know, let's look at what the agencies have done and where it's worked well, where it hasn't. Nobody's doing this work thoroughly. Instead, they're putting all of the money elsewhere. You know, we as professionals have social responsibility here. It's not just a question of our own careers. It's a question about what we owe society. People think we are the smart people that know this stuff and that we're experts. I mean, why is it that a large section of American society is losing faith in experts? Partly because experts do things. It's a principal agent problem. Experts do things that they like to do, they're trained to do. And they want everybody to believe that their human capital is of high value. And when there's a paradigm shift, what you're really telling your colleagues is, you know, that intellectual capital you thought you had that was valuable, you know, it's not. And therefore, if you read Kuhn, I could not go with the mission and the passion I do down these pathways if I hadn't read Thomas Kuhn's Logic of Scientific Revolutions 3 times over, which he wrote when he was at Berkeley, by the way. And you realize that a lot of this stuff around scientific change and scientific revolutions has got to do with human behavior. It's not about understanding things. It's about closing your eyes to certain things. You know, we could, if we could wipe everybody's minds clean, Connie and I and half a dozen others that spend our time in the innovation field, we could get the whole field up to speed in 6 months. But we don't have that because we have all the clutter of yesterday's intellectual frameworks that, you know, 100 years old. And as I think I mentioned the other day, for me, this big surprise was to find this statement by Ed Mason, in the American Economic Review in the 1950s about Schumpeter and dynamic competition, saying this is clearly the correct way, but we don't know how to implement it. But everybody should be paying attention to it. We don't know how to implement it, so I don't know what to do. And it sat there for almost, you know, a century before we're cranking away trying to do something about it. And that doesn't make us look good. Us as a profession look good, in my view. We've run for the neoclassical finesse and squeezed out the relevant stuff, and now we have society mad at us, at least in the US. We have society mad at us. The universities getting raked over the coals, and in part it's because of the lack of relevance of a lot of work that's done. And a lot of good work is therefore shut down because the rest of us haven't carried our weight and done things that help society, that focus on what's important for the long-term survival and sustenance of society.
Well, I think on that inspiring note, I think we may need to draw to a close because of timing. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Professor Teece for his remarks and for all the inspiration he gives to all of us every day.